Imagine this. You are one of the most powerful women in England. You have jewels, castles, and the crown. The king is obsessed with you. He changes the religion of an entire country just to be with you. But 3 years later, you're on your knees, blindfolded, waiting for a sword to cut your neck. How could someone fall so quickly? This is the story of Anne Boleyn, the queen who changed England forever and lost her head in the process. She wasn't born a queen. In fact, she wasn't even nobility. Anne Boleyn was simply the daughter of an ambitious politician who knew how to play his cards. But Anne had something that made her stand out. She wasn't the typical English lady of her time. She had spent years in the French court, where she learned music, poetry, and something that would prove dangerous for a woman in the 16th century, her own ideas. When she returned to England around 1522, King Henry VIII court was a place of intrigue, ambition, and temptation. The king, a tall, red-headed, athletic man of 31, had been married to Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, for more than a decade. But there was a huge problem. They didn't have a male heir who could inherit the throne. In those times, this wasn't just a family disappointment. It was a national crisis. Without a male heir, England could fall in a civil war after the king's death. Henry was desperate, and then Anne appeared. She wasn't like the other ladies at court. While most had blonde hair and pale skin, and had dark hair and penetrating black eyes. She wasn't conventionally beautiful by the standards of the time, but she had something magnetic. She knew how to sing, dance, and most importantly, she knew how to converse. In an era where women were expected to be decorative and submissive, and had opinions and wasn't afraid to express them. Henry noticed her. Of course he noticed her. The problem was that he was already married, but even more problematic, and wasn't willing to be just another royal mistress. Her own sister, Mary Boleyn, had already been through the king's bed and been discarded afterward, and wanted more, much more. "I will be your wife, or I will be nothing," she told the most powerful king in England. A risky move that would change history. Henry was obsessed. He wrote in more than 17 passionate letters that still survive. In one of them he says, "If it pleases you to remember your slave, send me a word of comfort from your beautiful lips." The King of England, the man who could have whatever he wanted, was begging for Anne's attention. But there was a gigantic obstacle, the Pope. To marry Anne, Henry needed to annul his marriage to Catherine, and the Pope refused. The Catholic Church would not allow such a scandal. Most men would have given up. Henry decided to change the rules of the game. If the Pope wouldn't give him what he wanted, he would create his own church. Thus the Anglican Church was born, with the king as its supreme head, a religious schism that still persists today, all because of one man's desire for a woman. Imagine it for a moment. A king willing to confront the greatest power in Europe, risk the stability of his kingdom, and change 1,000 years of religious tradition, all to be able to marry you. It's the kind of story that seems taken from a romantic novel. But for Anne, it was just the beginning of a very dangerous path. In January 1533, after years of waiting, Anne and Henry married in secret. By then, she was already pregnant. Anne's coronation as queen was a dazzling spectacle. The streets of London were adorned with tapestries and flowers, and sailed down the Thames in a golden barge, followed by 50 more boats. She was crowned with the same crown that Edward the Confessor had worn. The girl who had started as a lady-in-waiting was now the Queen of England, and all of London knew it. On September 7th, 1533, Anne gave birth. The court held its breath waiting for the much-desired prince. But it wasn't a boy. It was a girl. They called her Elizabeth. Henry was devastated and promised him that male children would come later. But they didn't. She had 3 more pregnancies, a miscarriage, a stillborn boy, and another miscarriage. Each failure weakened her position, and Anne's enemies, who were many, began to move. Because Anne wasn't exactly popular, Common people called her the Great Whore and the Black Bitch. They blamed her for the rejection of the beloved Queen Catherine and for the break with Rome. The nobles despised her for her relatively humble origins. Even her own uncle, the powerful Duke of Norfolk, secretly conspired against her. And something worse was happening. The king, the man who had turned his kingdom upside down for her, was beginning to get bored, and was intelligent, fiery, and had a strong character. The very qualities that had bewitched Henry at first now irritated him. And there was a new lady at court who caught his attention, Jane Seymour. Blonde, docile, and quiet. Everything and was not. The queen noticed. The fights between her and Henry became legendary. Witnesses told of how they shouted at each other in the palace hallways, and knew she was in danger, but she couldn't change her nature. She couldn't be the submissive wife Henry now desired. And then, the final nail in her coffin. On January 29th, 1536, Catherine of Aragon, Henry's first wife, died. Many saw, and, as the usurper, the intruder who had stolen the throne from the true queen. With Catherine dead, Henry could get rid of and marry again without the scandal of having two living queens simultaneously. 5 days after Catherine's death, and suffered another miscarriage. The fetus, some reports say, was male. And it was then that Henry whispered a phrase that would chill anyone's blood. "I see that God will not give me male children with this woman." What happened next was quick and brutal. On April 30th, a court musician named Mark Smeaton was arrested and tortured. Under extreme pain, he confessed to having been the queen's lover. Within a few days, four more nobles were accused of adultery with, and including her own brother, George Boleyn. The accusations were absurd. It was said that Anne had seduced these men, planning to use her influence over them to murder the king. More ridiculous still, it was alleged that she had committed incest with her brother to conceive the male child she so desperately needed. On May 2nd, 1536, Anne was watching a tennis match when some guard approached. They informed her that, by order of the king, she was arrested and would be taken to the Tower of London. The same tower where she had stayed the night before her coronation would now be her prison. During her interrogation, Anne maintained her composure. "I am as innocent of these charges as the child who has not yet been born," she declared. But her fate was already sealed. Henry had decided to get rid of her, and the state apparatus was fulfilling his wishes. The trial was a farce. Witnesses contradicted each other. The dates of the alleged adulteries did not match Anne's documented whereabouts. But none of that mattered. On May 15th, she was found guilty of treason, adultery, and incest. The sentence, death. As a final act of mercy, Henry changed the method of execution from burning at the stake to decapitation. And in an extraordinary gesture, he had a special executioner brought from France, an expert in using the sword instead of the axe, so that death would be quicker and less painful. The 5 men accused of being her lovers were executed first, and had to listen from her cell to the cannon shots that announced each death, including that of her own brother. On the morning of May 19th, 1536, Anne Boleyn prepared to die. She asked to make one last speech. This woman, who had been at the center of a religious revolution, who had changed the course of English history, now only asked for a few final words. She was taken to the scaffold, where a small crowd had gathered. She wore a red damask dress, the color of martyrs. Her long black hair was tucked under a cap. In a clear voice, she pronounced, "Good subjects, I am not here to preach, but to die, according to the law and by the law. I come condemned to death. I do not contradict my sentence. May God save the king and grant him a long reign, for there was never a more noble or merciful prince. If anyone wishes to examine my case, I beg you to judge me with kindness." Then she paid the executioner, as was customary, and told him, "I have a small neck," and laughed nervously. She knelt. The executioner raised his sword, and in one clean stroke, and Boleyn's head was separated from her body. The woman who had risen higher than any other in English history fell. Anne's body and head were placed in a simple arrow box and hastily buried in the Tower Chapel, without mark or ceremony. Henry had already moved on. 11 days after the execution, he married Jane Seymour. It seemed that Anne Boleyn would be erased from history. Her portraits were destroyed, her coat of arms eliminated, her name rarely mentioned at court. But fate had other plans. Because that little girl, the disappointment Anne had given Henry, Princess Elizabeth, would grow to become one of the greatest monarchs England has ever had. Elizabeth I, the Virgin Queen. Elizabeth never spoke publicly about her mother, but she wore a ring with a secret portrait of Anne, and many historians believe that her decision to never marry was influenced by her mother's tragic fate at the hands of her father. And Boleyn's story is fascinating because it is contradictory. She was victim, but also manipulator. She was devout, but used religion as a political tool. She rose higher than any woman of her time, but fell in the most brutal way imaginable. 500 years after her death, and continues to fascinate us. Movies, series, novels, and songs tell her story again and again. Her ghost, they say, wanders the Tower of London, carrying her head under her arm. And her legacy lives on in every Anglican church, in the current British monarchy, and in the way we understand power, ambition, and the price we sometimes pay for them. Was an innocent victim of a tyrannical king, or an ambitious woman who played with fire and got burned? A convinced religious reformer, or simply a woman trapped in a world of men, trying to survive as best she could? Perhaps she was all these things at once. And perhaps that's what makes her story so captivating. Because Anne Boleyn was neither a saint nor a demon, but a complex human being caught in extraordinary events. Henry VIII had 6 wives. The first he repudiated. The second he beheaded. The third died after giving birth. The fourth was repudiated. The fifth beheaded. And the sixth survived him. An old English saying sums it up: divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived, and was the only one who truly transformed an entire country. Her life shows us how fragile power can be, how dangerous it can be to stand out too much, and how difficult it has historically been for women to navigate male-dominated spaces of power. But it also shows us the extraordinary impact that a single person can have on history. Without Anne Boleyn, perhaps England would still be Catholic. Without her, Elizabeth I would not have existed. Without her, the history of Europe and the world would be fundamentally different. This is Anne Boleyn's true legacy. Not just a queen who lost her head, but a woman who changed the course of history. And spent barely 1,000 days as queen. 3 years, a blink in historical terms. But her impact continues to resonate centuries later. In an era where women were little more than pawns in male games of power, she dared to play the game herself. And although she lost in a tragic way, she left an indelible mark. Meanwhile, Henry, the man who ordered her death, spent his last years as an obese, paranoid king with a gangrenous leg that constantly oozed pus. He died a cruel tyrant, feared but not loved. His obsession with a male heir proved ironic. His only healthy daughter, Anne's daughter, will become the monarch who defined the era that bears her name. Anne's grave remained unmarked until the 19th century, when Queen Victoria ordered a commemorative plaque to be placed. Today, every May 19th, the anniversary of her execution, fresh flowers appear in that place. No one knows who places them. Imagine Anne's last thoughts as she knelt on the scaffold. Would she think of her little 3-year-old daughter, whom she would never see again? Of a king who once loved her with such passion that he defied the Pope for her, and now ordered her death? or perhaps of how she had come so far, from her humble origins to the crown, only to end up on her knees before an executioner? We will never know. What we do know is that Anne faced her end with extraordinary dignity and courage. Her last words were not of hatred toward the king who betrayed her, but of loyalty, a final political act, protecting the daughter she left behind. Because Anne Boleyn understood something that many forget, history is written by the survivors, and she wanted to make sure her daughter survived. When the cold steel of the sword cut through the air that May morning, it not only took a queen's life, it cut the final link between England and Rome. It marked the beginning of Elizabeth's rise, and it added a fascinating chapter to the story we continue to tell 5 centuries later. Anne Boleyn, intelligent, ambitious, magnetic, complex, a woman who refused to be simply what others wanted her to be, who changed a kingdom by the force of her personality and paid the ultimate price for it.